I want to talk about the medieval philosopher Peter Abelard's remarkable theory, his exposition of the Christian doctrine of the atonement. Now, I discussed yesterday how Abelard rejected the so-called ransom theory of the atonement. By the way, a theory that's been accepted by many great Christian thinkers, Origen, Augustine, Gregory the Great, and so on. And Abelard concluded that this theory made no sense. But if he rejected that, what was Abelard's theory of the atonement? Well, Abelard's theory begins with an exposition of Paul's letter to the Romans, in which Paul emphasizes the centrality of grace. And what Paul means by grace is that it is that salvation is a gift from God. It is an unmerited gift. It's given by God out of God's, you may say, graciousness. And it is not something that is achieved by human merit. Now, Abelard completely agrees with this. He says, without grace, no one can do the least thing. But this raises a deep problem, and Abelard is very aware of it, which is that if redemption is entirely God's doing, and no human effort at all is required, how can you explain why some people are saved and other people are not? How do you explain salvation and damnation? Now, one way to explain it, and this way became very influential a little bit later during the Protestant Reformation and specifically with Calvinism, is the idea of the elect, that God predestines certain people for salvation and he predestines other people to damnation. In other words, God has favorites. God chooses. He decides, yes, you, and you, but not you, and not you, and not you. And very interestingly, Abelard is discussing this issue of God playing favorites and the issue of merit. He's discussing this issue at least a couple of hundred years before the Reformation. Abelard takes up a text that is referred to by Paul in Romans 9:13, but Paul is actually quoting from the book of Malachi, and here's the quote attributed to the God of the Old Testament, to God himself. Jacob have I loved, but Esau have I hated. And Paul himself is a little, you can tell, startled by the quote, because Paul says, what shall we say then? Is there unrighteousness with God? In other words, is God himself consigning people to damnation? Here's Abelard talking about this. He says, the apostle, meaning Paul, rightly raises an objection on the basis of the preceding words, which is, Jacob have I loved, Esau have I hated. He goes, it is as it were an accusation, an indictment of God, who by not predestining Esau judged him worthy of hate even before he was able to merit anything, and withheld from him such grace as he gave the other brother when his brother likewise had not previously merited anything. So here's Abelard saying, wow, I mean, how could Esau be good when God never gave him the grace to be good? How can we defend, if you will, the justice of God if God is playing favorites in this way? Now, Abelard, this is how Abelard puts it. He says, yes, God does have the right to choose who he chooses. God doesn't owe us anything. The potter has full rights over the clay. But Abelard says that even if God is sort of vindicated on that count, God doesn't, in a sense, owe us grace. He doesn't owe us salvation. He hasn't wronged us if he doesn't give it to us. Abelard says at the same time, how do you blame somebody for not doing the right thing, for ending up in hell, when God never gave them the grace that they need to get into heaven? Here's how Abelard puts it. He goes, if someone is not saved, what fault is it of his, since God never willed to give him the grace by which he might be saved, and he could not be saved without it? Now, Abelard says, at the first glance, you're tempted to say, wait a minute, maybe what God does is he offers grace to the sinners and saints alike, and the saints say yes, and the sinners say no, and so it's not God who's to blame, it's we are to blame for our own damnation. But Abelard very shrewdly says, this doesn't entirely work. It doesn't entirely work. Why? Because Abelard says you need grace to choose grace. Even though God may offer grace, it takes grace to be able to recognize what God is offering, the importance of it, and to say yes. Even that human act of saying yes does require grace. Abelard gives a rather chilling example of a doctor who brings a medicine to your house to cure a patient, but he says the patient is sort of too weak to take it. The patient can't sit up. And so Abelard says, whose fault is it that the patient doesn't get the medicine and dies? It's not the patient's fault. The patient didn't have the strength to sit up. It's obviously the fault of the doctor and the doctor can't say, wow, I brought the medicine, if the doctor doesn't sit the patient up and sort of make sure the patient takes the medicine. It is obligatory on the doctor to administer the cure, not merely provide the means to the cure when the patient is not in a position to avail of those means. The way that Abelard defends the justice of God in the end is he does it this way. Abelard says, yes, it does take grace to recognize grace. But you know what? That grace, the grace to say yes to grace, God has given to everybody. In other words, God has given to everybody the grace to be able to exercise a free choice, the grace to be able to make their own decision. If they need grace to make that decision, they have it. But despite having the grace, they have the ability to, in a sense, say, you know what? God has given me the grace to say yes, but nevertheless I choose to say no. Abelard gives the example of a rich man who goes into the marketplace and there are a bunch of needy people there, and he tells them all, listen, I've got a great, priceless gift to give all of you. And all I want you to do in exchange for this gift is essentially to come under my service, or to say yes to me, to give full acceptance, if you will, to this gift. And some of the people go, yeah, I want it. I'll take it. I agree with your offer. I accept it. Other people say, well, you know what? Very nice of you, but I don't really want it. I don't want to be part of your generosity. I don't want to draw closer to you in this way. I don't want to accept any kind of obligation or lordship of you over my life. And so, even though I have the grace, you're making the offer, you're giving me the means to say yes, I'm choosing to say no. So this is really Abelard's, I think, beautiful theory of the atonement. Why? Because it is an effort to reconcile the indispensability of grace, which Paul emphasizes in the book of Romans, with the ability of human beings at the end to be able to say yes or no to God. God is responsible for our salvation, but we are responsible for our own damnation.